Hi, I'm David Petersen, the creator of Mouseguard, and welcome to Creator Commentary for the third series of Mouseguard, The Black Axe. This episode will cover Issue 3, or Chapter 3 when it was collected into a hardcover edition. This commentary will not have the book's visuals. Please feel free to follow along in your copy of the story, either in issue form or from the hardcover, as I talk about behind-the-scenes details, art notes, and my headspace, as I go page by page and panel by panel. Also, a fair warning, there will be lots of spoilers if you have not yet read this volume or the rest of the Mouseguard series. The outline and script for this issue are dated February of 2011. For Black Axe, I was doing a lot more script work before I'd start drawing an issue, something I did later, or as I drew, for fall and winter. Where before I'd rely heavily on the outline to guide me, this issue seems to have much more of a script than an outline. I'll mention the outline points each time we pass one in the pages. I've talked in the past about having goals for different issues or chapters, some main point that I'm trying to get across to the reader. Beyond moving the story forward for Kellinaw and M to now find the axe, I wanted to introduce a weasel that wasn't evil. He's not friendly towards prey, but he's not a cruel villain character. I'll talk more about this idea when we get to some specific dialogue of Luthor-Ben's later in the issue. Here's the original solicitation text that Archaea used to promote this issue of the comic. On an unmapped island, Kellinaw and M discover the land of Ilder, ruled by a ferret king. Shipwrecked and with no sign of their ship's captain Conrad, they become the audience of Ilder's imposing sovereign and hear of his hunger, his power, and his fear. All while a mythic weapon dangles just out of reach, preventing destiny from marching forward for the bloodline of Farer, forger of the Black Axe. Cover. The cover features Kellinaw and the Ferret King Luthor-Ben. Originally, I'd roughed in M to be on the far left side, the back cover, but I ended up liking the image better with her omitted, so I didn't ink her in the final piece. Because I have to draw covers so early for solicitation, I've not usually started on the interiors for that issue when I do the cover art. I mentioned a similar problem for the cover of Black Axe number 1, and wanting to be sure I get the image right because I'll have to match the details of it when I get to that same scene in the interior pages. My earliest version of the background rough was similar to this, but the architecture was all drawn in Photoshop with the line tool. There was a photo of a flagstone floor, perspective tilted in, and a hand-drawn throne that didn't match the angle of anything else. And so, I leaned into my hobby of making an architectural model of Ilder Hall, months before starting the issue, so that I could do the cover. I'll talk more about the model when we get to the scenes inside the issue. Inside front cover. The visuals for this intro text were based on Folio 187V in the Book of Kells. I substituted the angel for the black axe and the winged lion for an owl. The mention of Vulpes, another name for a fox, is all about cunning and battling opponents with words and ideas rather than blades. In the Kellinaw story, this is significant because of how he will acquire the axe through his word, rather than taking it by force. In fact, thus far, and through the end of this issue, we have not seen Kellinaw use his sword. He has it in his paw at the ready. In fact, he brandishes it towards Luthor-Ben in this issue. But it is never swung or makes contact with a beast in these 3 issues. Page 1. The outline for this page says, Kellinaw Awakens. Panel 1. While the text mentions blackness, the entire panel is color held to be a deep dark blue, like where we left Kellinaw at the end of the last issue. I inked this panel solid black on the original page art so that when I sold it, the first panel didn't look empty and unfinished. Panel 2. I wanted the reader to feel that sudden gasp of air after a character has restarted breathing, after being seemingly dead. Panel 3. The landscape Kellinaw is seeing is faded as his sight returns. From the black in Panel 1 to the slightly overbright Panel 3, I was thinking of Han Solo in Return of the Jedi, saying of his recovery from carbonite freezing, "Instead of a big dark blur, I see a big light blur." The look of this panel is also an echo to the look of Ilder from issue 2, ghostly and dreamlike, as though it might not truly exist. This ties in with the idea Kellinaw thinks he's dead, and in the mouse afterlife of Saiyan. Panel 4. The scale of Kellenau in this panel is such that I'm trying to show him being alone, that ongoing theme for his character. I've given view of enough shoreline to inform the reader that Conrad, M, or any sizable wreckage of the Red Snapper aren't nearby. I enjoyed seeing Kellenau's pauldron hanging off of his arm. I get very used to keeping my character's clothing on model and not having it move much or deteriorate, so this was an opportunity to play with that, to show how disheveled a mouse washed ashore would be dressed like. Panel 5. This entire scene of Kellenau awaking through his senses of breath, sight, and pain were influenced by the moment in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Harry awakens after Voldemort kills him. I acted out this achy pose to try to get the posturing right. And Kellenau's broken bones? Well, this is a nice cheat that I can write in, but not need to deliver on in full. Obviously, Kellenau doesn't have a broken leg, arm, hip, or skull. But I guess it's plausible that he could still do everything he does in the issue with a broken toe, finger, tailbone, or rib. Also, I can't be positive, but I'm fairly certain that this page is where I switched from using Uniball Vision office pens to ink MouseGuard to using Copic multiliners. Issue 4's cover was inked in advance of this issue, so it definitely has a Uniball ink job. But from here on out, I'm pretty sure I use Copic's ink pen to do all my line work. Page 2. Outline note for the next 3 pages. Kellenau searches for his companions, finds Ben. Panel 1. In the script, I'd written the narration text of panel 2 of this page, but not the dialogue for this panel. But I wanted to show, not tell, to help illustrate Kellenau's raw throat. Like I'd played with lettering and balloon shapes for Conrad's drunkenness in the last issue, I did the same to help lead into the next panel's narration. Panel 2. All of the sand and background scenery line work are color held, an area where I want the lines to be a color other than black, and I had to paint around the stones, shells, and wreckage to isolate the landscape's inks. Panels 3 and 4. I wanted the reader for a moment to believe that M may have died here. I haven't shied away from mouse deaths in my books, so I like that the reader can expect that at any time, characters aren't safe. Along with Kellenau's aches, raspy voice, and broken bones, I wanted to give M a malady that showed how physically punishing the shipwreck was for them. But ultimately, I don't do much with either's condition besides use it in this scene to say to the reader, they are shipwrecked and really hurting now. Panel 5. Here we see glimpses of pages in M's book to reveal that her book is actually the illuminated artwork for the Black Axe lore, even the pages we saw in Fall, which means that the record of the legend being fact that Midnight found to make him believe in the lore and history, and even the 1152 whereabouts of the axe, was M's book. The waterproof birch pages idea came from a tale I'd heard about the Lewis and Clark expedition, that Meriwether Lewis's journal, with valuable information, was nearly lost in a river on the journey. But because those pages were birch bark, they were waterproof and not ruined. I can't seem to find any record of that story now, though, and the only thing I can research that comes close is that birch bark was regularly used by Native Americans for waterproof canoes. Anyhow, I needed a way for M's book to survive the shipwreck and being washed ashore. Page 3. This page is a vertical mirror of the previous page's panel layout. Panel 1. I have M's hood down here, and I'm not quite sure why. It goes right back up again in panel 3. Kellenau's narration quickly, probably a little too quickly, ties up what he believes to be Conrad's fate. Panel 2. Because I had the dialogue and narration already written before starting this issue, a bit of a new technique for me at the time, I was able to figure out visuals to complement the text rather than the other way around. This panel as a map was the best way I felt I could show what was being said. It's a bit abstract, and perhaps this is a map that M includes in her book, but it certainly illustrates the idea that M and Kellenau need to move inward on the island. Panel 3. This panel echoes the panel of Ben standing with the axe in issue 2. In fact, the rocks are exactly the same. Kellanah is standing in the spot Ben was meant to be. Note the bird shapes in the sky. They are not just there to recreate the Ben panel, but as a slow reveal on the next page. Kellanah's narration was me addressing a logical question I figured the reader might be asking. How do they know they are in the right place? The right piece of land in the sea? Panels 4 and 5. The discovery of mouse bones certainly tells the mice something. Also, it turns out that after all those mouse skeletons I drew in Winter Issue 4, I still really enjoy drawing mouse bones and using them as a storytelling device. Page 4, panels 1 and 2. As M confirms this is Ben, something the reader knows for certain because of being able to see the visual connection of his clothes, Kellanah asks for the reader how she can be so certain. So, to make it believable that M would certainly know what Ben's tunic looks like, she doesn't just recognize it because she'd seen her brother in it, but because she'd made it herself for him. This was a detail I figured out while I was writing this issue, to patch the logical hole of how they would recognize Ben's bones. Panel 3. M's connection to birds is already established in the dialogue, but bringing back the crow motif was something to tie back to her companion that died in issue 1. Beyond that, the crow or raven is also known for being a symbol of wisdom. Panel 4. And as M speaks crow to them, they give her knowledge an echoing cause. I see the crows of Ilder as the eyes and ears of the land, and with the crow motif seen all over Ilder Hall, Luthor-Ben and the ferrets must see them that way as well. In the dialogue here, the crows do confirm that Ben brought the axe to Ilder, something I contradict in the epilogue, but more importantly, I purposely left it vague who killed Ben, a way to drive M and Kellanah to Luthor-Ben, even though he's not Ben's murderer. Page 5. The heading of this section of the outline says, Kellanah and M arrive at Ilder Hall. Panel 1. The entire top of that landscape leading to the hall and the hill is inked black, feathering out to tick marks as it blends down the hill into grass. Then, I did a color hold during the digital coloring stage to push back the silhouette as part of the landscape affected by the atmospheric distance. Panel 2. The exterior of Ilder Hall. I wanted Ilder to pay homage to my Danish heritage. Granted, I ended up being very casual with all of my Scandinavian influences as I went on, but this hall is meant to be the first part of our understanding of a culture in Mouseguard that has roots to the Norse people of our world. For the model I used for the cover, I only needed the interior, but while I was building it, I made sure I added the modular pieces to show it from the outside too. Its design was very much influenced by Hedal and Borgrund, stave churches in Norway. The smoke pouring out of the vents in the cupola was added after the fact by making thumbprints on an overlay sheet and adding them in as smoke in the digital coloring stage. M and Kellanah are very, very small in this panel. That's not just because of trying to get them in scale with the architecture, but also because I wanted them to feel insignificant as they were about to enter a belly of the beast leg of their hero's journey. In fact, their figures are solid black forms in the original ink, and I painted a color hold on them to give them their color suggestions during the coloring stage. Panel 3. The crisscrossed crow head motif on the beams, and later Luthor-Ben's throne, were a nod to the relationship between the ferrets and the crows sharing the island, in perhaps some harmony, maybe even an alliance. I think there was some connection to Odin's ravens too, but I never did anything more with that. The flower shape in the frieze over the entryway is of 3 flowers meant to be a nod to some of the flower emblems of Denmark, the forget-me-not. Kellanah's narration in this panel is to give the audience a Jack and the Beanstalk realization. Whatever lives here is big, and not mice. The smoke in this panel was inked with my thumbprints directly on the page, and then color held to be more smoke-like. Page 6, panel 1. The sense of scale is reinforced again by this vertical panel, where I could make the doors tall, weasel-sized, large gates, and then show our mouse characters right against them at the point of entering a non-mouse dwelling. The herringbone weave of the door is a repeating motif throughout the ferret clothing and architecture. Kalinaw's narration again mentions his matriarch Bronwyn, who the reader understands to be just that, his matriarch, not yet realizing the deeper connection of their love and how it commands him. Panel 2. The reluctance Kalinaw has was never meant to be a refusal to move forward, but a steady patience that involves him weighing best practices. In this case, he doesn't want to tip off the inhabitants by trying to open those huge doors, suddenly throwing daylight into the room and making a lot of noise in the process. Kalinaw's narration about his feeling of attachment to Em as familiar kin now is something I did so that her loss at the end of issue 4 and the resulting mourning in issue 5 felt sincere. The dialogue while Kalinaw and Em utilize their diminutive size and crawl under the door is a reference to the idiom, "Are we men or are we mice?" Panel 3. A larger panel for some impact of scale, but also to get plenty of room to showcase a new location. I built the model for Ilder Hall in a modular style, so that portions could be removed to get better views. But that also means that I only built one of the 2 sections of columns, and I would need to move the model, take a second picture, and then assemble the photos together digitally to get a full length of the hall. The ceiling is lined with a row of triangular open-air skylights, either side of the central vent that has the cupola atop of it in the exterior views. These vents allow for the fire pit smoke to rise and also let in a bit of light into the hall. There are several visual motifs I want to draw attention to. The pillars have a design of the stylized forget-me-nots between rows of an abstracted thorny thicket pattern. The banners feature crisscrossed crows, and the frieze murals that run the length of the hall are crows overlapping weasels. Unfortunately, I never draw a panel where we can really get a good view of it clearly. To avoid covering too much of the environment, but also to suggest the characters are whispering, I made the type as small as I could while still being readable. The tails of the balloons also squiggle to suggest whispering. In that dialogue, the smell of ferrets is referred to. I did that because a neighbor I had in high school kept a ferret as a pet, and the kid my age from that family complained that the ferret had a musk that smelled really bad. So, in a nod to that, but also to suggest that guard mice are trained to identify based on scent, I mentioned the ferret odor. Page 7. This page is a 90-degree rotation of the previous page's panel layout, and the outline lists this as the Ferret King scene. Panel 1. This cutaway top-down panel was to help explain the space more, to show the approach of the mice while waiting for the next panel to do the proper close-up of the Ferret King Luthor-Ben. Panel 2. Here we get a better close-up of Luthor-Ben. His cloth sash is red with a white cross pattern, like a Danish flag in the form of a plaid. His crown has 3 forget-me-not flowers atop it, like the frieze above the exterior doors. I do regret how hard it is to see Luthor-Ben's right hand in this composition. It becomes too easy to mistake the other ferret's paw holding the goblet as Luthor-Ben's. For the visual styling of the ferret's architecture and clothing, I used a lot of repeating and similar patterns like scale mail, diamond-shaped shingles, braids, woven straps, herringbone, and I colored them mostly in warm yellows, rusts, and browns. It's hard to see, but the side of Luthor-Ben's throne is stuffed with crow feathers. More of that crow relationship. In Luthor-Ben's dialogue, he references having already feasted and being so full that he couldn't eat another bite. This was a necessary starting condition, so that I could have this scene between him and the mice without reason for an attack. It was one of those concerns I had for the pre-Mouseguard 1149 version that eventually led to Mouseguard, where I wondered how to have mouse characters interact with other characters who are natural predators. I'll talk more about Luthor-Ben and wanting this encounter to have other meaning behind the lack of predator attack in a few pages. Panel 3. I think the dialogue is a reference to Sirius Black's line to Harry, "Are you going to kill me, Harry?" That deep, dark background was meant to have suggestions of tunnelways that led to underground quarters, larders, and workspaces, but I opted just to make them black spaces to keep the detail focus on the characters. I felt Ilder was detailed enough already. I used the feast having ended also as a reason to have the hall mostly empty of ferrets. I felt that an open space between our mice and the Ferret King actually added more suspense and drama than if there had been 24 ferrets packed in there. Page 8, Panel 1. Kellanau does brandish his weapon towards Luthor-Ben in this panel, but by the end of the next page, he has it pointed away from him. Panel 2. To avoid having to figure out a new civilization of mice, and also not give Kellanau and Conrad a tempting option of staying on Ilder in later chapters, I established here that the island no longer has any mice. What happened to them? I assume they were overhunted. Luthor-Ben is pacing and encircling them. I wanted this to feel a bit like Shere Khan in the Jungle Book, but with a longer, lithe ferret body to surround them instead of a tiger. Luthor-Ben now first speaks the name of the island Ilder. I must have mistyped it after translating it, but Ilder, Ilder, is a Danish word for ferret. Panel 3. Kellanau is angry in this panel about Luthor-Ben's suggestion of repopulating the island, not just because of it being incestual with her as a relative of Kellanau's, but also because M is much, much older than he is, and this causes him to lash out with an insult of his own. Luthor-Ben encircling them on all fours helped me be able to keep all the characters' faces in these panels. If Luthor-Ben was standing, he'd be out of frame, or if I was focused on Luthor-Ben, the mice would be. And the only exception is if I used a lot of forced perspective angles, and that would get old quick. Page 9, Panel 1. One of Luthor-Ben's aides has his sword at the ready for the king. Perhaps he is anticipating this argument to escalate, or that after having taken away his dishes on the last page, it is common for this ferret to bring the king his sword. I wanted to portray a weasel character that was not a villain. He could be scary, he could be ferocious, but not a villain. And so in this panel and the next, the dialogue mentions honor. Panel 2. This is the first time both mouse and ferret dialogue appear in the same panel. To help suggest the differences in accents and language the further away a species gets from a mouse, I used a different font for the ferrets. But I chose one that was similar enough to the mouse dialogue font that the reader could still read it, and that it made sense that the mice would understand it. I play with this concept even further in a few pages. Page 10, Panel 1. I decided to give the ferrets a naming pattern. It's a first name, or portion of a first name, combined with a color, one that has something to do with fur color or markings. Luthor-Ben is a combination of Luthor and Eben. Luthor was my grandfather's middle name. Luthor-Ben is a black-footed ferret, and so that's where the Eben in his name comes from. Panel 2. Other ferrets must have heard the conversation, as they have started heading into the hall's main chamber to bow to their king. The idea that the ferrets wouldn't stoop to chasing around food as small as a mouse, something that wouldn't satisfy the hunger of a single ferret, let alone a whole kingdom, is something I wanted to use as a logical way to have these two mice be able to interact and deal with Luthor-Ben. But also, I thought it provided a good distinction between a predator and a villain. The line in the previous panel about only taking what he needs, and here talking about providing for his subjects efficiently, is not only not a villainous mindset, but honorable. As I knew I'd already made reference to the Weasel War in Fall to suggest evil weasels, and like most talking animal fiction, equating predators to either being bad or evil, I wanted an instance where that wasn't the case, but without making a vegetarian vampire, as it were. Panel 3. And Honorable Kellanau takes Luthor-Ben at his word and sheathes his sword. With this being the only panel on the page that included mouse dialogue, I opted to make it a closer view of the mice to switch away from weasels or wide pulled back panels. Panel 4. Filling the hall with weasels who are all bowing to Luthor-Ben was meant to give the reader assurance that none of his subjects would harm the mice either. Page 11. Panel 1. The axe arriving at the gates 5 years ago means 1110. In issue 2, M claims that the axe vanishes from history in 1086. That leaves a lot of vacant time. The epilogue of this book tells the story of Ben giving the axe to Merrick, but it starts with Ben and M's parents being killed, and then jumps to Ben wanting to give the axe to a mouse who could exact revenge. So it seems that Ben may have had the axe for some time before giving it to Merrick. and then Merrick's killing of mice as well as the trip to Ilder. Does this account for 24 years worth of missing time? I don't know. Luthor-Ben mentioning the crow's memories is a nod to the incredible memories real-life crows have for recognizing human faces. Panels 2 through 4. Instead of more talking heads, I opted to show flashbacks to various beasts informing the ferrets of a mouse's plan to destroy them all. This was another chance to play with fonts and lettering to give the implication of accents each animal had, including the herons, just answering with question marks rather than "huh?" or "I don't know" in a special font. The hedgehog's dialogue about this mystery creature ruling is supposed to echo the idea of Midnight from Fall, that the axe can be used as a weapon to crown a mouse as almighty emperor, not just of mice, but of all creatures. In that same dialogue, the reference to piling up the bones of his enemies was a visual I did in Winter with the mouse bones in Darkheather, likening Merrick to the genocidal event by the villainous weasels there. Page 12, panel 1. I chose to set this scene during a feast for a few reasons. One, I wanted to show the hall full of weasels who would witness Merrick's arrival. But two, I wanted to set up a similar scenario to Kellanah and M's arrival, with a very different outcome, where Luthor-Ben was willing, even with better food in front of him, to slay and eat Merrick for his gall. The roasting carcasses. What are they, you might ask? Well, I've forgotten. I thought I had that written down somewhere, and it seems that I don't. I'd assume that they are young wild pigs or something bigger than a weasel, but smaller than a fox or adult pig. Panel 2. I wanted to do an upshot to make this ridiculous scene as epic and impactful as possible. I also needed to find a way to make the mouse believably backlit so that he appeared as a silhouette, since at this point, Kellanah and M, nor the reader, are supposed to know this isn't Ben, but Merrick. Note, Merrick also opened the door. Look where that got him. Panel 3. We cut back to the present day for the ferrets around Luthor-Ben, M, and Kellanah to laugh at this point in the story. I'd done a digital overlay on the previous 5 panels to give that hazy look of a flashback memory. Now on this panel, we return to solid black ink lines and crisper colors. I tried to play with the sizes of the letters as well as their placement for all the laughter to make it look more like real out-of-control laughing and less like typed ha-has. Page 13, panel 1. I regret that Luthor-Ben's pose looks so much like the ferret to the far right in the last panel on the previous page. With Mouseguard being an all-ages book, I have to be careful about striking a balance of not being too safe and saccharine, while also not being too dark and graphic. Most of the time, it's not an issue, but here the dialogue of Luthor-Ben's is fairly gory, which is why I opted to have him talking about it rather than to show that moment as a flashback panel. Leading up to Black Axe, I did warn fans of the series that the books would become a bit darker and more serious as time went on. I used the advancement of the Harry Potter books as an example. And this moment describing a ferret cleaving a mouse in two and swallowing both bits isn't as graphic as it's gonna get in this volume. Panel 2. A close-up reaction panel of M and Kellanah realizing that since they found Ben's bones, this couldn't possibly be him, which also means Ben's killer isn't yet known. Because of the twist that comes in Chapter 6 that the bloodline of Farer is not meant to wield the axe, only to pass it between wielders, I had to lead the reader, as well as Kellanah, to believe that Ben was the one who had been using the axe. Panel 3. Hiding the axe. On the cover, it was simply tied to Luthor-Ben's belt, but I needed it as a reveal for the mice. So I created this little sling or pouch on Luthor-Ben's belt that you can see as far back as page 10. The name Merrick is a form of Mark, which has its root in the name Mars, which means warlike. Panel 4. And there's the first view the reader and the mice have had of the Black Axe itself. We are over halfway through the 3rd issue, and it's only just now being seen. I'm proud that the first 2 chapters didn't suffer for that. And as Kellanah didn't know for certain that any of this axe lore was real, the physical axe ending up where it was last reported to be seen, now in front of his eyes, makes all that myth and legend real. Page 14, panel 1. This is my go-to pose for Kellanagh when things get serious, I guess. He kneeled like this before Gwendolyn and M, and now Luthor-Ben, as he begs a bit for the axe. The shape of the horizontal panel was a way to fit in all that dialogue and not cover up anything important. Panel 2. Mike Mignola has talked about having characters, usually villains, go into these long, expository, and grand Shakespearean speeches, and then by contrast having Hellboy reply with something like, "Shut up," or "Says you." I tried to pull that off here after Kellanagh gets long-winded in the panel prior by having Luthor-Ben's response be just one word, nay. But I think I ruined the effect in the next panel. Panel 3. The behind-the-back view for this panel was for me to avoid repeating the same front-on images of Luthor-Ben and his throne. It was a real trick to get that axe to show up. As a black silhouette shape, it was easy for it to get lost in the black tunnel backgrounds or when being held in Luthor-Ben's black paws. In this panel, I had him dangling it out there in an area where it would only have the flagstone floor behind it, so it would easily show up. Luthor-Ben is also using the axe as a symbol, so in many ways he's using it as most mice do. 20 seasons is 5 years. Measuring time in seasons was something I'd wanted to do more of in Mouse Guard, but I worried that the big numbers next to a time measurement would be hard for people to get an instant feel for. Like, an 80-season mouse is actually only 20 years old, and it's hard for anyone to assume 80 is young without forcing them to think about the math and do the conversion. Page 15. The outline for this page says, "Ferrets come through the front gates, 2 carrying 1 dead." Panel 1. I couldn't have Kellanagh give up on trying to get the axe through barter. In many ways, his dialogue here connects to the idea in Jeremy Bastian's Legends of the Guard story, where mice were at one time servants to other beasts. Panel 2. Another change of angle to switch things up, but also to show the threat of the many, many ferrets who will all be hungry enough again soon to have no qualms about eating M and Kellanagh. With Luthor-Ben's dismissal of Kellanagh as a servant comes a newly imposed time limit. A few sunsets, and they will need to be out of there. Panel 3. And in panel 3, 2 archer ferrets come into the hall carrying another. The extra space on the sides of this panel showing the columns was so I could be pulled back far enough to get the ferret's hind paws in. I wanted it to be clear as possible that the middle one wasn't holding up their own weight. Page 16, panel 1. The ferrets carrying in the other are named Keith Hazel and Garth Hazel. Combinations of Keith and Garth, which were names of my father's cousins, with the color hazel. And they are bringing in Aaron Eben, which is Aaron and Eben. My uncle's middle initial was an A, but now I'm not actually so sure that his middle name was Aaron. In the desire to get a really good look of shock in Luthor-Ben's body language and him dropping that sword, I don't think I accounted for where the rest of the length of the sword actually goes. Panel 2. The family connection linking Luthor-Ben, named after my grandfather, and Aaron Eben, named after my uncle, is now clear to the reader and to the mice. Panel 3. This panel is here only to add a moment of tension, to add a beat for pause before Panel 4, where it is revealed for certain that the king's son is dead. Page 17, panel 1. While these other ferrets have the word hazel in their names, I did opt to color them differently, meaning that the color suffix to their names can be more of a clan or family title that may or may not be directly linked to their fur colors or markings. I thought it was important for the 3 ferrets to have been collecting water when the attack came for this scene to play out as tragic. If they had been hunting or provoking the fox, I'm not sure it would have worked the same way. Panel 2. Luthor-Ben's outstretched paw hovering over Aaron Eben's face like he wants to touch his son, but doesn't, is supposed to represent that feeling of losing a loved one, where you can touch them physically, but they are no longer there. You both can and can't reach them. Panel 3. I remember playing a lot in Photoshop with the pencils for this panel. I kept taking my drawings of the king and his son and enlarging them, making them fill more of the space. I wanted Luthor-Ben's grief to fill the panel, but then I'd feel like I'd gotten in too close and lost the pose and the connection points where Luthor-Ben is holding his son's limp and lifeless body, and I'd shrink them down again. I do find it interesting that I gave Luthor-Ben, who I feel is an honorable and noble king, a bit of a self-righteous grandeur who has allowed the fox the briar, as though the island truly belongs to Luthor-Ben, as opposed to him ruling over the ferrets who live there. Page 18, Panel 1. This panel, as well as Kellanagh himself, are very small, so that Kellanagh's voice seems small in the scene. It's a large act he's offering, but the sound of his proposal should seem like a squeak in that hall of sorrow. Panel 2. Luthor-Ben's face may be angrier than I had intended, though he definitely doesn't see a mouse as being able to do what a ferret cannot. Panel 3. I wished I'd done this scene from Kellanagh's other side, so that he'd be facing to the right, in towards the page rather than out towards the book's edge. Panel 4. I think I really got the feeling of lifelessness out of Aaron Eben's lolling head as Luthor-Ben carries him. Luthor-Ben's first line is supposed to be a bit of a nod to Boromir, saying that one does not simply walk into Mordor. Page 19, Panel 1. This silent panel just before Aaron Eben's corpse is set on the fire was because I couldn't find a good way of drawing the act of it being placed there. The best I could do was show this moment before, and then show it ablaze in the next. Panel 2. This panel offers a slightly okay view of that weasel crow freeze pattern I mentioned before. Kellanagh's choice of wording about the funeral was on purpose. As fans who have already read the Winter Book know, Kellanagh is put to rest in a similar funeral pyre at the end of that book. And here Kellanagh is also so close to that axe, he could almost touch it in this panel. Panel 3. It is hard to get the facial acting performances I wanted out of these creatures without resorting to over-the-top acting pantomime or blobby tears. But I think the head position and eye focus on the fire conveys Luthor-Ben's sorrow in this panel. Panel 4. The positioning of the figures so that both would be in view at this angle, and that Luthor-Ben is recognizable enough that the reader understands what we're looking at, was a real trick to get right. It's one of the reasons I like drawing figures separately on paper and then scanning them into Photoshop on different layers so that I can adjust them and resize them and reposition them independently of each other. Page 20, Panel 1. Luthor-Ben is saying what I was thinking and what I was sure the readers would have been thinking if I had just had him give Kellanagh the axe in this moment. Panel 2. In any good team book, each member needs to contribute, or have sacrificed in a way to make sure that the task was done. If any of them could have stayed home or their sacrifices didn't contribute to the end goal, the team member becomes a redundant one, or one who loses their worth. Even though Em had contributed in many, many ways to the adventure and education of Kellanagh, I wanted her barter to be the reason the axe is released to Kellanagh. Page 21. This page is a 180-degree rotation of the previous page's layout. Panel 1. The panel is large here to put some heavy weight on the moment. Though we are right behind the mice, we are reminded of the scale of them to this place, and therefore also to the as-yet unseen fox. Luthor-Ben's body language is meant for him to be literally weighing the axe and his grief for his son. Also, as we are winding down with the interior shots of Ilder Hall for this issue, you can see why having a model to explore and reference and use for perspective is so helpful. I think there are some folks who think that the time investment isn't worth making the model, that I'd be further ahead just drawing the panels and pushing through the work. And I know, with this much detail in this building, I'd have never been able to do it all without the reference. And none of the panels would have been as interesting. Panel 2. I really dislike this panel. I don't think I got either mouse's face or expression right, and I don't care for the word faith being used the way it is here, or at least not used alone. Perhaps if she had said, "my faith in you," Mouseguard has no religion, and that's on purpose, so that the mice don't have a deity that they believe in that can make things right for them. Everything about their survival is up to them. No miracles. Page 22, panel 1. This vertical panel with Luthor-Ben considering and deciding on the deal is the last time the axe will be held by anyone other than Kellanagh until midnight in the fall of 1152. Panel 2. And finally, the moment the whole book series has teased. That moment when Kellanagh's paw first touched the axe. And yet, I still couldn't give you that moment in this panel. I had to give you the split second before his paw holds it. Panel 3. As the last bit of the deal terms are said to a departing Kellanagh, notice how Kellanagh's sword is now hanging from Luthor-Ben's belt, where the axe once was. Undoubtedly it will now be there as a symbol too. Page 23, panel 1. The passage of time is something important to show in stories, not only because having Kellanagh start this horrible task just as the sun has set enhances the mood, but also because it shows that they've taken time in getting to Ilder Hall, and time dealing with Luthor-Ben since the midday start of the beginning of the issue. Panel 2. The weight of the axe line was meant to be thematic for the weight of the task and consequences ahead, just like Kellanagh says, but also because I'd assume switching from something balanced like a sword to something top-heavy like an axe would take some getting used to as a primary weapon. Panel 3. The issue ends on a pretty dark tone, not just because of the lighting due to lack of daylight, but also of the idea that Kellanagh awoke on the shores of Ilder at the start of the issue, imagining he'd reached mouse heaven, and now he feels like he's entering a personal hell. Like last issue's ending, the theme reemerges of Kellanagh being alone. Pin-up by Duncan Fegredo. I met Duncan in 2010 at the San Diego Comic-Con. I'd been a fan of his work on Hellboy, and I think we'd exchanged emails once before we'd met in person. We talked about our mutual love for Harry Potter, and I commissioned Duncan for a piece for my Potter original art collection. When he delivered it, I was really thrilled, but before getting a good look at it, the conversation moved on to Mouseguard, and he was telling me about a scene he liked in Winter, issue 4, the part with the song. And it literally made me cry, hearing him say such nice things about the storytelling of that scene. I tried to brush away the tears and explain that I was crying because we do this creation in a vacuum. Sometimes it's hard to know if what we think is good actually works until a fan lets you know. And in this case, the fan was a creator whose work I respected. He knew how to tell stories with drawings, and he was complimenting mine. Anyhow, it wasn't until I got back to my hotel room that I noticed he'd made the dedication out to Peter instead of David. I opted not to say anything about that, but still share a photo of the piece on social media to brag about the art commission. Duncan replied by saying, "Oh no, I must have been tired when I drew that. I didn't realize I'd given Harry 6 fingers." I quickly counted, and he was right. I laughed and tweeted back at him that perhaps Hermione had cast a spell on him that gave him an extra digit to help catch the snitch. Duncan also offered to do this pin-up then, and our emails between us seemed to be mostly about scheduling and file uploading, not much creative talk. But I know I was blown away by the visual he turned in. I was only a few pages into the issue when he did this. I had sent him the first 2 issues and the cover of this issue for reference for King Luthor-Ben. And I decided I needed to up my game as I drew the issue to keep up with Duncan's ferret anatomy. And that's the 3rd issue of Mouseguard the Black Axe. It has been collected in a hardcover edition published by Archaea. If you've enjoyed this commentary, please leave comments in the section below. Let me know what I didn't answer for you in this issue, and subscribe for updates when I add more Mouseguard commentary. Thank you for listening.